Now, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When Jesus said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things he was doing. The gospel of the Lord. Be seated. Imagine a small child, fresh tears just beginning to dry on her cheeks, carefully cupping in her hands the pieces of a broken toy, her favorite toy. Each step forward requires intense concentration to avoid not spilling any of the precious pieces that are needed for restoring that toy to wholeness. See, it's not just any toy that's been broken. It's a special one, and the many hours of delight that that child has known at play with that item, they're now cut short. And those broken pieces so carefully cupped in those trembling little hands lies the hope that what has been shattered can be repaired. Hope that joy will once more be found. Her eyes welling up with that threat of fresh tears, they're full of questions as she anxiously awaits the diagnosis. Is it ruined? Can it be rebuilt? In my family, the person most likely to fix anything that was broken was my dad. And if it was in pieces, Dad could put them back together. And if that on button didn't turn on, well, Dad got things running again. Well, my father's status as Mr. Fix-It, it didn't just stop with me and my brother. But when my brother had children, they believed that their grandfather, or Papa as they call him, could fix anything. When they lived just a few miles from my parents, Dad could make a house call, or the item could be brought very carefully to Papa's house. And then after they moved out of state, sometimes a broken item was saved patiently for months until Papa made his next visit. I can still see my father walking into my brother's house in Texas and immediately being dragged off by the arm somewhere by my oldest niece to inspect her mangled, twisted up headphones. What a gift it is to be able to take something that is trampled and broken and restore it. To bravely venture into that chasm that lies between fractured and whole and build a bridge. You shall be called repairer of the breach. What powerful words those are that we've been given to hear today. Powerful and wonderful words from God spoken in the voice of the prophet Isaiah. God's people, have caused a break between themselves and God. They were in exile. They were living in a foreign land full of people with different gods and different beliefs, and they had forgotten the intention of the Sabbath. They had forgotten the will and the interests of God. They had forgotten what it means to be chosen, to be set apart. They've begun to act like everyone else. The breach the separation. It's become so wide they can't even see what's on the other side of it. And that separation, it seems to be self-perpetuating. I mean, the greater the distance between Israel and God, then the less aware God's people are of God's presence with them. And then the gap just widens all the more. Now, to be sure, this breach is one-sided. Although God's people's actions take them further away from God, God remains as near as always. God's close by. God's at the ready to respond, "Here I am," as soon as the people remember their need to call out for God. But through the words of the prophet's message, God cups bits and pieces of Israel's broken relationship and the trampled Sabbath. God cups it in God's hands. This message points to the painful reality of the breach with which God's people have burdened themselves. But the message also provides the glue and the tools needed for the repair. The breach the people have made between themselves and God is also the breach they've created between themselves and the hungry and the afflicted. They stand on the other side of a chasm that's the difference between serving their own interests and serving God's interests. Isaiah's words from God rise up to God's people above that trampled Sabbath, above the broken relationship, and the prophet announces to the people, God's promise is not broken. God is present. God is a light in the darkness. God is holy. God is delightful. And Israel, you are still chosen. You are set apart. You are God's people. God and God's holy day can and will overcome the self-perpetuating dilemma of that ever-widening breach. Keeping Sabbath is both the experience of the promise, but it's also the response to the promise. Because Sabbath is joy and sustenance. Sabbath is freedom from the yoke of serving oneself. You shall be called repairer of the breach. The means to repair the breach belong to God's people all along. God gave it to them long ago when God made the covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. When God led God's people out of Egypt and across the wilderness. When God gave the law on Sinai as a way to live as chosen and as set apart. Sabbath, a day of rest, is a promise even older than the covenant. It's a promise as old as creation. It's a day set aside by God for restoration and for repair. A day when resting in the faithfulness and the love of God can repair the breach between people and God. It's a day that calls God's people to repair the breach between those with food and those who are hungry. It's a day that calls God's people to repair the breach between those whose needs are met and the afflicted. I think perhaps this is what is on Jesus' mind on that Sabbath day in the synagogue. A day that he is keeping and honoring by teaching those who have gathered. And we should acknowledge, though, that the leader of the synagogue and the crowd gathered there, they are keeping Sabbath too. They've come to the synagogue, they're listening to the teaching of this traveling rabbi. So Jesus and those gathered, they're doing what they do on the Sabbath at the synagogue, but then a woman, bent and crippled, appears in the crowd. She's probably late because it took her longer to walk to the synagogue than all the others who can stand up straight to walk. But Jesus, standing at the front of the group, he has a better view of her as she comes in. But I wonder, had the crowd been facing the same direction as Jesus, would they have seen her anyway? A woman, part of their community, but weak and bent over, probably unable to work or produce, a burden, relying on others to care for her. She's invisible. She's on that far side of the breach between those who can stand up and those who are bent over. No, even if they had been looking right at her, they might have looked right past her. And so Jesus calls out to her. He brings her forward and he gives her a true Sabbath. Jesus, without hesitation, he crosses into that breach that separates this woman from the rest of those lives around her, and he declares her free. The synagogue leader he's in a tizzy. And perhaps maybe he's still dizzy from the speed with which Jesus has suddenly brought that woman and her brokenness and the break of the community right into focus. The synagogue's leader's heart is in the right place. He's only trying to defend the separateness of the Sabbath. And it's not the healing he's against as much as the day that it takes place on. She's been crippled 18 years, he explains. There are 6 other days in the week. What would it have hurt for Jesus to remember her, to seek her out and heal her tomorrow? But Jesus knows that the work of the kingdom is now. Jesus knows that God's mercy doesn't wait. So Jesus again brings the focus of the crowd and the synagogue leader right back to the real issue at hand. He zooms in on the smallest act of mercy that's permissible on the Sabbath day, setting one's work animals free so they can take a drink of water. And then pow, full size, unavoidable, he says, is not this woman, a human being, a daughter of Abraham? In other words, a Jew, a fellow observer of the Sabbath with us, is not this woman entitled to her freedom? And then there is the question at hand, as plain as if it were written in the scroll of Isaiah, whose interests are being served on the Sabbath? Is it a quiet Sabbath for observant Jews, or is it a Sabbath that's set aside for satisfying the needs of the afflicted? And why not both and? Why pit those two things against each other? Jesus calls them one and the same. The entire crowd rejoices at the wonderful things that they have seen Jesus do to repair this breach. And let's not forget the woman who shuffled in, bent and broken. She was healed and she was reunited with her community. And in her keeping the Sabbath, she found delight in God indeed. And what was her immediate response? It was praise. Whether we have the prophet Isaiah speaking to long ago Israel, or we have Jesus teaching the crowd in the synagogue, both scriptures bring into focus the edge of those many breaches on which we stand. And they appear too numerous to count and too vast to cross. Breaches between those with health insurance and those waiting in line at the free clinic. Between those who can just pop in and pick up a gallon of milk at Hy-Vee and those who are waiting in line at the food pantry. Breaches between want and need, between the comfortable and those without comfort. If we draw a line, if we create a border, it will ultimately represent a breach with someone on the other side. It's us or them. It's in or out. It's privileged or oppressed. It's born in the USA or immigrant. All of those divides and more, they trample over us out in the world 6 days a week. But today we are here. And we have witnessed and we have participated in the baptism of Renner Joe. And we're here to be reminded that we are chosen and we're set apart. As God's people, we're different from all of that. We're not here to run and hide, but we're here to face the sorrows of this world. And we're here to delight in the promise and the hope that in God our many breaches are being repaired. In the confession of our sins, in the forgiveness of God, in the prayers that cry out for repair and restoration, in the offering that's given to feed the hungry and help the afflicted, in the meal that feeds us with God's grace and love, in a handshake of peace. We are here Here to remember the one who went to that cross with the bits and pieces of our broken lives in a broken world cupped carefully in his hands. And we're here to remember the one who emerged from that empty tomb alive, forever repairing the breach between death and life. We're here to worship and praise that one, to proclaim our delight of that one. We're here to be guided and to be strengthened for our calling. The calling that's for those other 6 days of the week, where we're called to join with that voice of Isaiah and the voice of Jesus and announce God's gift of freedom. And then to make that announcement, not just in our words, but in our actions, and without hesitation, knowing that the kingdom is now and knowing that God's mercy does not wait. So, people of God, go and be sent. You shall be called repairers of the breach. Amen.